Right, and here in studio for this conversation is a Human Rights Watch researcher, Elizabeth Deng. Many thanks for joining us in studio. And we also have a lawyer, Eddy Orinda. Many thanks for joining us in studio. And like we've heard the gentleman speaking just now, they say that these two gentlemen are being held by Kenyan forces. But what proof do you have? What evidence do you have of that?
Thanks for having me. First, to clarify, I'm with Amnesty International, South Sudan researcher.
We apologize for that.
So, I think as their lawyer will confirm, the Kenyan authorities have not denied or acknowledged their detention. We, however, have information that continuously confirms that they are indeed being held by the Kenyan police.
What information is that? If Eddy could clarify.
If I may, Samuel Deng went missing on the night of the 23rd after he had contacts with some of his countrymen in Nairobi. And just about 24 hours later, Henry Idri goes missing as well during his morning jog, doesn't return home. The whereabouts of the two remain unknown. We know, and it's public knowledge based on how vocal they've been on Facebook and other social media forums, that they've been very, very vocal critics of the government in South Sudan.
Right.
We have information from numerous sources, reliably, that they have been detained. The police have, however, neither confirmed nor denied those allegations. We have made personal contacts with the DCI. I have been to the police stations. We've made inquiries. They have feigned a lot of ignorance on the matter. And in any case, the 48 hours provided for in law have elapsed. So we would expect that some energy would go into locating where these two individuals are, their whereabouts, the last phone calls they made, and so on. But what's of utmost concern to me as a lawyer, in fact, is that the government risks being portrayed as having very little respect for human rights. If you recall, last November, Gadet, against all principles of international law, and rules that protect him as a refugee with official refugee status, was still deported back to South Sudan, where he is now facing arbitrary detention. And that's against the principle of non-refoulement. Kenya has to begin to respect its obligations under international law. So we want to call on the government to do everything it can to locate these two individuals. If they're being charged with anything, they have a right to access counsel, they have a right to be brought before a court of law, they have a right to get in touch with their families and so on. And so we continue to be very, very concerned that it's almost clear that the government is showing no concern over...
Right, and we'll speak to Elizabeth as to why these two are in Kenya, but it's still speculative as to whether they're being held by Kenyan authorities or not, because I understand in October 2015, Luwak was actually attacked in his home here in Nairobi, and it was said probably linked to South Sudanese ties. So could that be the situation happening today?
I do not anticipate that would be the situation, because then there would have been an official response from the government based on the press conferences we've issued, contact that we have made from them. These are not ordinary individuals that you would assume have been in a conflict with the fellow countrymen, and therefore by extension go missing, and there's no information whatsoever regarding their whereabouts. So we think this is deliberate. We spoke to very reliable sources that confirmed on the night that Samuel went missing that he was actually being held at an undisclosed location. And so we continue to insist that the rule of law has to be upheld. Mr. Deng has to be granted his rights before the law to defend himself if he has to. The UNHCR that has responsibility over him in the country has to be informed should there be necessity to deport him. But in any case, if he has to be deported, if he's not welcome in Kenya, still the actions that we're about to witness by having them being deported are against international rules regarding protection of refugees. So he should then have a safe passage to a different destination, and not one in which it is clear that is going to face torture, arbitrary detention, inhuman and degrading treatment. That would be very, very disappointing, should it be confirmed that indeed they have been deported back to South Sudan.
I mean, and Elizabeth, Eddy brings in the issue of upholding human rights and ensuring that dignity is upheld. But with having worked with Amnesty International and the case of James Gatdet that has been mentioned, how serious is the situation?
Well, the situation is extremely serious. We have been monitoring and documenting the practices of arbitrary detention and torture by the South Sudan government. We have confirmation that James Gatdet, indeed, when he was refooled back to South Sudan by the Kenyan government, has been in the custody of South Sudan's National Security Service. He has not been charged. He has not been brought to court. He's held in solitary confinement in conditions that amount to ill treatment or torture. And this is just part of a continuous pattern of long-term arbitrary and communicado detention by the South Sudanese government of anyone it sees as hostile to them. So both Deng Samuel and Agre Idri are members of the South Sudan opposition movement. They are vocal critics of the government. They have been active on Facebook and social media. We believe that this has played a role in triggering their arrest.
Right. And I mean, Eddy, before we've had issues, different issues between South Sudan and Kenya. And when the conflict in South Sudan broke out again, re-emerged rather, we had talks in Kenya of deporting South Sudanese back to the country, especially the leaders and their families, so that they could focus on the situation there and not escape the situation. And in some instances, we've had Kenyan authorities say these persons could be a threat to Kenya's security. Could that be a reason for the detention?
In any case, the situations you cite must be interpreted within the meaning of the law. If they are a threat to security, that should be made public, and charges have to follow. But also to respond to your question on the situation in South Sudan, it may not be public knowledge, but Agre Idri was in fact involved very, very constructively in the peace talks before the war broke. And that is how he ended up being in Nairobi, even though, unlike Samuel Deng, he doesn't enjoy the refugee status officially under the UNHCR. But we must remember that this kind of actions can also lead to a backlash that we may absolutely have no control over. I mean, we have Kenyans in South Sudan. The Kenyan economy relates quite significantly to that of South Sudan in terms of the businesses we have there. Kenya is literally a financial hub for South Sudan, and so there's a lot of interdependence. We must not assume that this is not going to lead to a lot of diplomatic tensions. But of utmost concern to me is, in fact, the security of Kenyans back in South Sudan. Should it be public today or shortly after this that these two individuals have been deported back, when it's clear that they're facing, in fact, a possible execution, that might have a very, very serious backlash on Kenyans. So I want to call on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to take responsibility in ensuring that this is handled with a lot of care, and that issues are separated, because even though we may want to argue that the issues of South Sudan are best settled by South Sudanese, we also have obligations under international law to provide security and protection for those who are entitled to it. And Samuel Deng and Agre Idri are not an exception to this kind of circumstances.
I mean, and just as we wind up, Elizabeth, earlier this month there was a report by Human Rights Watch, I believe Amnesty International was part of it as well, that stated that East African governments had failed in upholding the human rights of their citizens, and not just in dispersing peaceful protests, but also in unlawful detentions and being detained without cause. Just explain the scope of how big that situation is.
Well, I mean, as we believe, Deng Samuel and Agre Idri are in the custody of the Kenyan government, and under those circumstances, they should have already been charged and brought to court. So this is already an arbitrary detention by the Kenyan government. I think the patterns of arbitrary detention that occur in South Sudan are really on another level than even what we have seen in Kenya. Where you have people, as long as 2 years sitting in cells in horrible conditions, deteriorating health, no access to anyone, to their lawyers, to family members, and never brought to court.
I mean, and, you know, another bigger question would be, have these two done anything to attract the attention of Kenyan authorities?
That would be very interesting information for me as a lawyer to get access to. Because as far as I'm concerned, under our Bill of Rights, very well articulated in our Constitution of Kenya 2010, and under rules of international law, the fact that you acquire refugee status does not extinguish your right to freely express yourself. Right. And in fact, it is provided for that the only limitation would be violent political activities that then put at risk the recipient country in which a refugee resides ordinarily. If you ask me, the presence of Samuel Deng and Henry Idri do not fit that kind of description, and therefore I do not see how that amounts to a violation of law. But in any case, if it does, they should be charged and brought before the courts of law. Yes.
All right, and that being said, as it stands, Kenya also has another dispute with South Sudan with regard to Kenyan citizens being detained in South Sudan. And you must be aware of this, Elizabeth. These 5 gentlemen who've been there for about 5 years now. Is it 4 years? And the situation, you know, we're not hearing much from the South Sudanese government. What is going on with that situation?
Well, these Kenyans, even before trial, they were detained for approximately a year without being charged. They were eventually brought to court, and by most analyses, the trial that took place really did not conform with due process or fair trial rights. These individuals were sentenced by the South Sudanese court to life imprisonment, and so they are still in South Sudan serving these sentences. Their families in Kenya have made numerous appeals to the Kenyan Ministry of Foreign Affairs to try to intervene on the basis of violations of their fair trial rights, that they should not be continued to be detained in South Sudan. Unfortunately, what they've seen is really an apathy by the Kenyan Ministry of Foreign Affairs to intervene on behalf of these detainees.
Right, all right. All right, thank you so much for speaking to us. Elizabeth Deng, a researcher at Amnesty International, and the lawyer Eddy Orinda are here asking for the release of 2 South Sudanese who they say may have been detained by Kenyan authorities and could face possible deportation back to Juba, which they say may be a risk to their lives. Now, as